Welcome back to our continued discussion of sufficiency. In this video, we return to this topic of tax dynamics, and what better way than to recall our friends at the Pheasant Lane Mall in the city of Tyngsboro. Recall that our hypothetical solution was to raise the rate, but then we realized we would suffer the consequences of a change in taxpayer behavior. Recall that we do not actually know how taxpayers will respond to a change in taxes. To answer that question, we generally turn to our friends, the economists, who attempt to build models that help predict what could happen. On this slide is what economists said about the Trump campaign tax plan. Take a moment to read it. In this case, the economists looking at this potential tax change were concluding that any growth created by the tax cut, regardless of how stimulating to the economy, could overcome the debt burden it would also help to create. This brings us to the age-old question, or questions. Do tax cuts stimulate the economy, and do tax increases hinder economic growth? Theoretically, there is little question. A tax cut should spur economic growth. The level of that growth is subject to much debate. An economist named Arthur Laffer made a career out of estimating this relationship with his Laffer curve. It was entirely supportive of the Ford and Reagan era economic plans. Although theory is supportive, actual history has yet to bear out this relationship between taxes and growth. For example, the Clinton administration oversaw tax increases and a strong expansion of the U.S. economy. In probably the only meaningful conclusion we can draw, it would appear that taxes are simply part of the economic growth equation, but certainly not its strongest element. When researchers cannot find big data to investigate hypotheses, we often turn to individual subjects in an attempt to see behavior at the micro level. Adam is a big star and makes $5 million a year. His marginal tax rate, that is, the rate on the next dollar of income, is 40%. If the rate increases to 41%, will Adam not want to take any risk or expend any resources in order to keep at most 59 cents of the dollar he earns? Kelly, on the other hand, makes $25,000 a year. Her marginal tax rate is 10%. If the rate increases to 15%, Kelly may really need the additional 85 cents per dollar and thus work for the extra income. Adam's need for the additional money is likely to be lower than Kelly, who is living paycheck to paycheck. In Kelly's situation, a tax increase is likely to mean she will need to find additional work to cover the now shortfall in after-tax cash flow. As for Adam, he may decide the risk of investing no longer warrants the investment and simply sit on his money. What is certain is that from the government's perspective, when it comes to raising revenue, it takes a whole lot of Kellys to equal one Adam. We describe Kelly's situation as the income effect, because Kelly needs the after-tax income to live. She will need to find a way to replace that after-tax cash flow. Adam, on the other hand, may simply decide the investment is not worth it. I'm going to Cabo. We call this the substitution effect, because Adam may substitute leisure for productive working time, noting that in this case, his time is actually his financial resources. This is simply a review of the marginal utility of income. Adam is much further down the curve than Kelly. Now let's turn to Blake, who's sitting on a pile of uninvested cash. In fact, it's $500 million. Blake is currently invested at the risk-free rate. That is the rate of return that matches inflation. There is no additional return for any risk being assumed by Blake. However, Blake is seeking a higher return and knows that to achieve the higher return, he will almost certainly have to take on some risk. But at least he knows he will be accommodated for doing so with a higher return. Taxes serve as a drag on that return because we know that pre-tax minus tax equals after-tax. So for any positive tax rate, after-tax returns will be lower. So at what tax rate will Blake decide the risky investment is no longer worth it? At a 0% tax rate, since taxes do not matter, they won't have any effect. At an 80% tax rate, which existed prior to 1986, Blake keeps only a small amount of his return. In fact, so little that he deems the investment worthless and doesn't turn his share. At a 50% tax rate, Blake keeps half and the government takes half. Somehow that doesn't feel fair. Research shows that at tax rates somewhere around 40 to 50%, people start to get uncomfortable with the after-tax return and will not make the investment. Does this mean tax rates should be 40% or 49%? Hard to say. It certainly depends on how the base is calculated. Because the U.S. economy runs on risky investment, we must have a system that encourages risky investment, and that means after-tax cash flows. As mentioned previously, presidential tax plans have not had the effects on economic growth that are often anticipated, especially by that administration. The current fiscal policy being espoused by the Fed seems to have a much greater effect, and tax plans should be put lower on the hierarchy and more time spent on government spending plans. Okay, one last item in this video. We've raised this issue of after-tax cash flows, and we will continue to do so for many modules to come. As a result, let's spend a little time on the relationship so we can get the most out of it. We know that pre-tax minus tax equals after-tax. In fact, that's nearly tautological. Since tax equals pre-tax times the tax rate, and if we use a few algebra tricks and substitute that in, we will find that after-tax equals pre-tax times 1 minus the tax rate. All we've done is restate the original equation, but in a way that you might find easier to use. If John has $100 of income and a 30% tax rate, under the long method, John's pre-tax is $100. His taxes are $100 times 30%, or $30. And thus, his after-tax income is $70. Or, you could say $100 times 1 minus 30% is also $70. Oliver, with $100 and a 40% rate, works the same way. $100 times 1 minus 40% is $60. We can use this same relationship to solve problems in reverse. If John and Oliver both seek a $60 after-tax return, what pre-tax return will be required? In this case, the pre-tax return is the unknown variable, and a bit of algebra yields the required pre-tax return for both. This is a handy shortcut to keep in your tax quiver. You can expect to have it exercised in your homework, and the quizzes as well. That brings us to the end of video T2C on dynamics, and closes out sufficiency as a good tax characteristic as well. Our next video moves to the second good characteristic, convenience. Thanks for watching.